welcome to our webinar tonight. It's a little bit different to what was advertised, but we thought we'll strike while the iron is hot, or relatively warm anyway now, and we will look at the Jubilee and all that goes with it. So we thought we'd strike while the iron's hot and do something topical. The normal LLA education series will resume next week. So if you think you've missed out, don't worry. That whatever was going to happen next week, which Steve is also going to be talking on, will happen in due course. So don't worry that you've missed out on part of the education series. But we thought, since we are very close to the Jubilee, it would be very good to do a topical issue, and that's what we're doing today. So now the pomp, pageantry and parties are over and the flags and bunting are down, the country returns to the normal state of never-ending crisis. What lessons can the Left Labour Alliance take from the Jubilee about our past and our future? The original title of this meeting was The Last Hurrah, Reflections on the Royal Jubilee. Not quite as advertised, Stuff the Royal Jubilee. There'll be an introduction from Republican Labour Working Group, followed by an open discussion with questions and contributions from those participating. So I will say no more, but hand over to Steve Freeman, who is our lead-off speaker.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to do a quick screen share, if I could, with you, so that let's see how this goes down here. A second. I'm going to do that. Oh, can I get the screen share up again? Sorry. Hit that button there. Do a share. And hit that button down there somewhere. I think that should do it. Can comrades see that screen share? It goes up there. There we go. That's it. Oh, well, okay. Welcome to the meeting, comrades. I always like to just do this one PowerPoint so that you can get some idea of where I'm going in my talk. I'm going to make a little introduction, and then I'm going to talk about 4 propositions that underpin what I'm going to talk about. Then I'm going to talk about the Crown and the Queen. So a little bit of sort of theoretical angle on it, because in Republican Labour, we're coming at it from a slightly different angle. Then I want to talk about bread and circuses. Then I'll come back to the Jubilee and the support the Jubilee's got. And then I'm going to come back to the Crown in crisis. And I'm going to end up with democracy and the working class movement. So I'll come back there to the beginning. So just as way of introduction then, so just to sort of leave that up there, I'm going to take that down now. I'm going to try and stop the sharing and then go back to where we are with my introduction. I'm going to talk, I think, for around about 20 minutes. So there should be plenty of time for comrades. So the slogan, the last hurrah, the last wave, or goodbye, I suppose, is a claim that we are living in an historic epoch. Maybe it's the last days of the Windsors or the end times for our constitutional monarchy, which is or was established 300 years ago. We're living in a system that goes right the way back to 1688 to 1707. And of course, in 1945, this regime, under the impact of the war, became what we call a social monarchy. That is, with a social contract that established a kind of mixed economy, a welfare state, the National Health Service, and etc. The things that comrades know about. The Queen, of course, ascended the throne in 1952. And although she became associated with this social contract, it was already formed before by circumstances before she came to the throne. But in some ways, we are celebrating the 70 years of the social monarchy. Until 1979, of course, when Thatcher started to destroy the social monarchy. And you can imagine that this dismantling or destruction of the social monarchy, the welfare state, as we might otherwise call it, which has carried on through Thatcher, through Blair, up until 2007, 2008, with the massive financial crisis followed by austerity, that we've argued in the Republican Labour group that we've entered a different kind of period where we are at the end, not only of the welfare state as we understood it, the social monarchy, but also the political aspect of that contract, which is the union and the constitutional monarchy. So the idea, the thesis or idea, if you like, is that we are living through an historic epoch. It doesn't mean we can predict the date or indeed the incident that will trigger some crisis that could lead to abdication or something like that, but merely that this is coming down the track. The country is not yet ready for a republic because there isn't a Republican movement, there isn't a Republican Party. Well, at least not in England. But I would argue that the socialist movement is completely and utterly unprepared for this circumstance. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So that is the kind of the 70 years on 300 years. That's the starting point of my introduction. Now, I wanted to emphasize in going over to point number 2, which I said was 4 propositions that I wanted to put before you to that underpin our thinking. The first proposition is that we need to make a sharp, extreme, if you like, separation between the Queen monarch and the crown, or if you like, between the head of state and the state. That's the first thing that I'm going to illustrate all the way through this. The second point is there is a big difference between anti-monarchism, we need again, and republicanism. The anti-monarchists, of which there are many, tend to focus on the Queen and Prince Charles and who's in line for the next job and how we should get rid of them and how they're hereditary and how much money they waste and all those other things. Whereas Republicans are focused, or should be focused, on the crown. Okay, and I would express this difference in a kind of, I suppose, an extreme, even ludicrously extreme way to say that as a Republican, I'm not interested in the Queen and I don't give a damn about the Queen and what they're doing. Now, that is not really true, but I might express it. My focus of attention is, as Republicans, we're interested in democracy and beyond that, liberty, equality, and solidarity. My third proposition would be that anti-monarchism is really an ideology of the bourgeoisie, except that the bourgeoisie in the UK, the financial aristocracy, as it were, is royalist and loyalist. And in a certain sense, it's a petty bourgeoisie that's taken up anti-monarchism, but that republicanism, by contrast, really belongs in the camp of the working class or the organized section of it. And again, that's a proposition that you might challenge or you might disagree with. And then my fourth and final proposition is that the English left tends to be anti-monarchist and not Republican. Corbynism, if you like, being the highest achievement in recent years that we've known of a mass working class movement with hundreds of thousands of supporters, with millions of voters. And it was not a Republican democratic. It didn't have a Republican democratic program. It was really a program to restore the 1945 social monarchy, to sort of get back what had been destroyed by Thatcher and Blair and so on. The English left, well, therefore, will tend to say, of course, we're against the Queen because we're anti-monarchists and she has no political power. So there's no need to waste time or energy getting rid of something that's largely irrelevant. So anti-monarchism leads you back into a kind of passivity, I would argue. Anyway, that's my 4 propositions. Now, I want to just say something about the Queen and the Crown again now, just to emphasize that point, and then we can move on to look at the Jubilee itself. Well, the Crown, for me, is a massive, powerful corporation. It's not a feudal guild. It's a modern capitalist business, a huge organization employing around about 4 to 5 million workers. There's a board of directors. Boris Johnson is the chief executive of it, with other key ministers of the crown, the mandarins, the chief of the security services, etc., are all part of that key element that actually manage the power of the crown. And remember that the Crown Corporation or state has these three pillars: Downing Street, Whitehall, and Buckingham Palace, all within a stone's throw of each other. Now, this doesn't exclude the Queen, by the way, because you could say the Queen was the chairman of the board. That's why Boris Johnson, as chief executive, has to meet her every week and give some account of as to what is going on. But we must distinguish between the crown as this totality of power, state power, economic power, political power, and this particular role that the Queen plays. On the other hand, the monarchy and the royal family, here you've got the Queen and the Prince of Wales, who run their own firm. We could call it Royal Family Limited, and it has its own objectives. It employs about 1,000 people, known in the political world as the palace. So we have two kinds of crises we could think about here. One, but separate but not collected. The crisis of the crown is a crisis about our constitution. It involves the crown in parliament, the relationships between the crown, parliament and people, and the relations between England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Whereas the royal crisis is about the crisis in the royal family, such as Andrew, Harry, Meghan, and who's going to be the next king. So these are, by separating these two ideas out, they're interconnected, but we need to see them separately. Okay, so let's come back with those ideas in mind to just look at the Jubilee itself. And I thought I'd start with the idea of bread and circuses, because I think that's quite a useful metaphor, which came from the a Roman poet called Juvenal, who used this very well-known phrase, bread and circuses, to describe how the governments kept the people of Rome happy. He said, two things only the people anxiously desire, bread and circuses. That is the distribution of free food and staging huge spectacles. So here in the United Kingdom, we have this division of labor. The crown is responsible for the bread, for feeding people, or not, or failing to do that. And the Queen and the royal family are responsible for the circuses. The Queen and the royal family, the royal circus is therefore a great distraction because it leads us away from where the center of power actually is. When the anti-monarchist left sees the royal circus passing across their TVs, they obviously feel disgust, feel impotent, and then it's not really worth doing anything serious about, because they tend to resort to the disease of economism, which has long weakened the left, to say, well, they say the people want bread, but not circuses, unable to see that the two things are two parts that kind of go together. One is to lead us away from the other. So the Jubilee served Boris Johnson a bit like a dead cat thrown on the table to distract attention from what was really going on. And I think that the slogan, stuff the Jubilee, is a bit like saying stuff the dead cat. Whereas we as Republicans want to say what we need to approach the Jubilee is democratic demands, democratic slogans, and indeed a democratic program. And as socialists, by the way, we follow Marx and Lenin, that the fight for democracy is not against the fight for socialism. On the contrary, it's the fight for democracy that leads us down the road to socialism. That's what they made absolutely clear. Right, so let me move on to point 5, just keeping my eye on the time there, comrades. Yes, okay, so the Royal Jubilee and its supporters. I had a couple of points to make here. The first one, on the World at One, Radio 4, the Johnny Diamond, the BBC Royal correspondent, reported from St. Paul's Cathedral. This was on the 3rd of June. It was a gathering of the establishment of church and state, with the hierarchy, a bit like the famous Tsar's wedding cake. At the very top is the Queen, who was absent that day. The next level down comes the royal family, minus Prince Andrew. Then below them is a layer of dignitaries, ministers of the Crown, MPs, lords, etc. Below them, the clergy, the bishops, and the like. And finally, at the bottom was a pile, well, bottom of the pile, as it were, or the bottom layer of the cake, were 400 common people, teachers, police, NHS workers, public sector workers, charity workers, etc. They've been invited to attend the celebrations. But if the Queen was missing, the Crown's chief executive turned up, and as Boris Johnson arrived, as we all know, the crowd started booing him. So the Jubilee celebrations that brought the masses onto the streets to cheer the absent Queen, what came with it was the political crisis, indeed the constitutional crisis facing the Johnson government. So here Crown and Queen are kind of mixed up in this melange. Popular anger could not be kept at bay and came flooding into the news. Tory MPs took note, and on Monday, as soon as the Jubilee was over, they triggered their vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister. Now, I'm going to come back to that moment, Monday, after it ended, in a second, but I did look at the support for the Royal Jubilee, and this is what I found out, just looking for an article in The Guardian. There was an ICM poll that estimated that the thank you day organised by, I didn't even know it was a thank you day, I wasn't paying that much attention, but anyway, there was a thank you day organised by the Together Coalition, said that it was the UK's biggest ever community event with 16.75 million people. That's 1 in 4 of the population participating. It does sound suspiciously like the Brexit vote. That was 16.75 million as well. But anyway, the poll then said that 8.7 million attended the thank you day and 3.3 million helped to organise it. And on the Sunday pageant on BBC One had a peak audience of 8.7 million viewers. And the Platinum Party at the Palace, you know, Rod Stewart, Diana Ross and all those types, had a peak viewing figure on the BBC of 13.4 million people. Now, I'd like to make 2 comments about that. The first one is that, again, to emphasize the meaning of republicanism, republicanism is very much about grassroots community organization. And even in such a royal event, there is that Republican community organizing bit that it must exist in smaller communities. Watching it on TV, like I did a little bit, but tried to keep away from it, was very much an individualistic kind of thing that you do in your own house. But those people who went out into their communities and went to parties and talked to their neighbors were doing something which I would call vaguely Republican, even though it was for monarchist reasons. If you are simply anti-monarchist, these numbers are demoralizing. But if you're a Republican, then don't get too worried about the circus and get your attention back onto the bread or the bakery. What is going on in the Crown Bakery? And remember that the boss of the bakery was being booed. So my 6th point is this, and this is called the Crown in Crisis. And I'm going to start with a letter from Jesse Norman, the Tory MP, former minister. He submitted a letter of no confidence in Boris Johnson the day after the Jubilee, as it were, ended. And he made a statement about the reasons that he would never serve again in a Johnson government. He made a number of objections. He said, well, Johnson had provided over a culture of casual law breaking in Number 10. But amongst the next set of issues that he raised were 4 constitutional issues. First, he said, any breach of the Northern Irish Protocol would be economically very damaging and politically foolhardy and almost certainly illegal. So we've got a big constitutional issue going on with Northern Ireland right now, which threatens the union. He said, although Johnson is the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, he is yet putting the union itself gravely at risk. And he's speaking about relations Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So that's another reason why we've got a problem here, a constitutional problem. Then he accuses the Prime Minister of trying to act like a president. He says, trying to act like a president and centralise power in Number 10, which is entirely foreign to our constitution and law. And the next thing, that last point that he makes, constitutional point, the move to criminalize noisy protests was something, he said, no genuinely conservative government should have done. Well, we can have our own views about that. We'd have to agree with that. But anyway, so he also makes some points about the economy, about asylum seekers, about privatization of Channel 4 that he's against. But the real thing is, he says, it's this relationship with the EU, this relationship with the Union of Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the creation of a presidential style of government by centralizing power and the attack on the right to protest, that means he cannot support Boris Johnson. And writing a few days before in the Times, Ian Martin, an insightful journalist, he describes the Crown in this way. He says, Britain does not have a functioning government. Of course, Whitehall is there, and a panoply of state power remains with all its attendant ceremony. The impressive buildings exist. Inside them are ministers, advisors, and thousands of officials spending hundreds of billions of pounds of the country's money. Underneath it all is a different story. There is drift, decay, and a disintegration of the decision-making process. A shambles, he says. So the message of the scandal in Downing Street is not about partisan wine, but the shambles that is coming from drift, decay, and disintegration. The Prime Minister and senior civil servants broke the law behind closed doors, but at the end of the day, it's one rule. They highlighted that it's one rule for those in power and another rule for the rest of us, and that's been shown up in front of the whole country, made very, very clear at the very heart, the crown at the heart of government. Now, I've spoken many times about the crisis of democracy in England, which I think the Brexit vote was also about. But now it has evolved to a higher level of constitutional crisis. The proroguing of Parliament was one sign of that. Ever upwards, we arrive at the ministerial code. Now, I think with time, I cannot necessarily take the time to go exactly into that. But I would say that the Prime Minister's meant to be accountable to Parliament, and what's been forgotten in all this, meant to be accountable to the Queen. After all, he is her First Minister, and he has to go and visit her every day. So nobody's mentioned this political constitutional point. What did the Queen know about what was going on in Downing Street, and when did she know it? Because according to the oath of constitutional oath of the Privy Council, the Johnson has to tell her the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about what's going on. I cannot believe she didn't ask him what the hell was going on in Downing Street, not least because, remember, they had the party on the eve of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. So you wouldn't be too happy about that, I can't imagine. So what did the Queen know? What did she do? Did she do nothing? Did she know nothing? Nobody's asked this question, but it highlights to me that we don't really have an effective head of state, that Johnson puts Johnson in a dangerous position. And the ministerial code has proved to be a complete sham. You know, it's kind of almost called to be an essential point, according to Peter Hennessy, the constitutional expert. The ministerial code is a crucial part of the spinal cord of the constitution. Well, in which case the spinal cord isn't functioning. Okay, so I am coming to my last point now, the very last point in all of this, which is about the working class movement and Unite's General Secretary Sharon Graham. At a recent conference, I think it was last year, Unite members voted to oppose Westminster's first past the post electoral system, pledging support for moves towards a new voting system in UK elections. General Secretary Sharon Graham said this, and I completely agree with what she said. Our political class has failed working people and our system is broken. It's time to change our democracy. This is exactly where republicanism comes in. And she went on to explain the Unite conference and how the members have voted. This is our Jubilee and the direction we must go in. The Royal Jubilee and the Democracy Jubilee, if you like, stand at opposite sides, opposed to each other. PR is the recognition of the problem of our broken democracy, but it's not the solution. We have to go back, and I'll end on this point, to Tony Benn and dig around for the various nuggets of democratic gold. And one of the gold nuggets, I believe, is the demand for a parliament for England as a leading part of the fight for the democratic transformation, or even a democratic revolution, so necessary if we want to get off the road that we're on, the road to authoritarianism, and get on a road that could take us towards socialism. So I end on that point, comrades. I think there's a lot more to be said on that, but yeah, I think that's a point to be end. I'll just conclude, maybe I'll just conclude, Carol, before I say this, just to analyse the point. It's really important that we understand the crisis of the crown and separate that from the interconnected point of the royal family, and not get sucked into this dead cat circuses distraction, which is real and it is important, and it is really important to take it seriously, but you have to see it as part of the total epoch that we're in, an epoch when the system is really breaking down and failing. So I finish at that point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Very, very interesting and very stirring talk, and very, very relevant, I think, particularly at this time of Jubilee. Thank you very much, Steve. Majorly important points made there. If you would like to, if you have questions for Steve, or you'd like to make a contribution, please put your hands up, your electronic hands up, using the reactions icon on your screen. So I see that we have some hands up already. That's great. I will make you into a panelist so that you can answer the question. So I'm going to make those people who put their hands up already, I will be making those into panelists. Okay, I'm just doing that now for Anthony and Paul, and Marion, I've lost Marion had her hand up. Marion, where are you? So that I can make you into a panelist. There's Anthony, there's Paul, Tony, and I'm not quite sure what's happened to Marion, because she definitely had her hand up, and there she is, right. And there's Marion. So please do. And Tony Greenstone. Right. We should have everyone made up now. Okay, so Anthony, over to you. Please, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please come up with a question that you'd like, or contribution that you'd like to make.
Thank you for the remarks. I think what we've got now is the worst capitalist crisis. I mean, there's many features like the February 1917 revolution, the crisis of the monarchy, crisis, economic crisis, the military crisis. They knew it was building up for about 15 months before the February Revolution, but they delayed the reforms, and it blew up. And there's similar crises there. I mean, it's important that we can't be sectarian. It's a major shift in line that people like Sharon Graham are saying these Republican ideas, posing important democratic demands and PR for greater democracy and representation for the left. Sectarianism would be one mistake. We've got to link up with that important trend in the unions. But another mistake, we'll go back to kind of pre-Russian revolutionary stages and with Lenin. Because like Lenin says, it's an important bourgeois democratic task to get rid of the monarchy, but it doesn't right with the socialist task, which will come first, will be determined by the balance of class forces and how the class struggle unfolds. But ultimately, the only solution now is a socialist solution. With the environmental crisis and all the economic crisis, the whole world's has to go that way anyway. But one thing I will say before I finish off is on Iran. You haven't just got the Ukraine crisis. I don't know if you've been following it in the last 24 hours, but they've actually the Atomic Agency's been moving on Iran. So they attacked the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan with rockets and the mortars. The US consulate, the US embassy, and also the Erbil International Airport. And they've shut up, because of the moving on them, they've shut down the 20 Samurai cameras in there. And Israel last week was planning massive military strikes with the Americans. I don't think they can do it without the Americans. and they've been testing out in the Mediterranean. So the major blow-ups coming. Al Jazeera is very worried this afternoon. So the anti-war movement nuclear is important. But if we don't stop the war, we'll all be dead anyway. But I'll finish here. A lot of youth are going communist. I know a lot of youth are going Trotskyists in Canada and America and this country because of the crisis. I've been talking about that for the last 12 to 18 months. But what could happen now is working class will link up with their own struggles to link up with this. There's a lot of problems with these people. It's a big radicalisation. I'll leave it anyway.
Right, thank you very much, Anthony. I'm going on to Marion now, and then Paul. Right, Marion, I'm going to go to you next, and then Steve, are you going to answer a few? If I take 3 people, and then you can answer the questions. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay.
I've got trouble. Hold on a minute.
Oh, hang on. Somebody is having problems there. Right. Are you all right? I can't. Marion, can you put your video on? Is that possible? So that I can spot.
I'll do that now. Oh, hang on. I'm
I'll go to Paul Collins first, okay? I'll go to Paul first, and then I'll come back to you. Right, Paul.
Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. As you were talking, one of the things that clearly got me in relation to republicanism and of the crown in the way that the people in power currently operate is with the lockdown rules and the fact that ministers of the crown, let's be honest, that's their official position. Every government minister is technically called a minister of the crown, aren't they? And I thought when I first heard this comment about the lockdown parties, I heard somebody say, I don't know where it was, but somebody made a comment that it didn't apply to the crown properties. And I dismissed it as a joke, but actually, if you look at the pressure that was applied to, that was put on the Metropolitan Police and Carissa Dick, who was the commissioner at the time, it was pretty clear that was the line that they obviously took. And of course, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner is an appointee of the crown, isn't she? Or whoever it's going to be next. So there we can actually see how the power of the crown operates and how the government of the day is currently using it. And as for attacks on democracy currently, I'd like to read out a quote that from a book that I just started reading. And it says, the issue therefore in a capitalist democracy resolves itself into this: either poverty will use democracy to win the struggle against property, or property, inferior poverty, will destroy democracy. And that was an Aaron Beveridge writing in Place of Fear. This is the second edition, but the original one was written in 1952, but the second edition was 1962. But you can see the way the government and the crown are operating today that quote that I just quoted is very apt for the situation that we're currently living in. That's all I'm going to say. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Paul. Steve, would you like me to bring in Marion now, and
Yeah,
then
hope so, yeah.
then you can ask
Sure.
questions, or do you want to answer questions now?
I didn't really get a question, I don't think, from Anthony, but obviously a comment on Paul's, I would generally agree with what Anthony said, I think, but he talked a lot about things that weren't directly relevant to this. But I think I'll wait until we've heard from Marion, I think, before I
Okay.
and then
Marion?
answer
Oh,
Paul,
Marion's
Marion,
been able to come
and
back in with a
Anthony.
video on. Great
Yeah,
stuff, Marion.
luckily I've sorted the sound system and that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a few problems there, wasn't there?
Yeah, I think
let me
it's
spotlight you. Okay.
I think it's a really good discussion tonight, and it's long overdue. I mean, I've learned a lot from Steve in terms of realising the importance of the crown and that, you know, because I must admit, probably prior to that, I hadn't fully grasped the importance of it. So I think that's really important. And the question of fighting for democracy is very important. But I think we have to realise if we utilise our transitional method, because I think that's really important, because consciousness is mixed, I would say. Like most of my sisters and brother are royalist, you know, they love the royal family and all that shebang, you know. I must admit I'm the exception to the rule on that. But I think the key thing is, how do we, I mean, Liverpool, there wasn't that many people at the celebrations there, and even in Birmingham. I mean, I've seen in Centenary Square more people on a demonstration than were there, considering it was free food and that. So I don't think it was as popular as it may have been, and I don't think the ratings were that great. And considering you had a concert, some people would have listened to it because of the people that were on it. So, but I think that our main task is, how do we change the balance of forces now and get people to recognise that, as Steve said, we're governless at the moment. There's no real trajectory. I mean, they're just muddling along from crisis to crisis, and they're allowed. I mean, the establishment, both in the Tory party and the so-called Labour Party, are playing the games, and they're all tied in with that. I mean, Starmer, look at him, he's all those things that he is, you know, and he's not a socialist. He's not even the social democrat of the old traditional right. You know, we have to look at where these people are coming from, and they don't really want real constitutional change because they're happy with the power structure as it is. So how do we change that? I mean, I'm not totally convinced about PR, I must admit. I'm still debating that. I think we do need constitutional change, but I don't know enough about different systems of PR of what would be more democratic. So I'm still doing some thinking on that. But I think the key thing is we have to think about, how do we actually make people realise the crisis we're all experiencing on every level since the pandemic. Every part of the system is in crisis, and there's real dangers at the moment, and I think people aren't fully aware of it. And because of the, as I've said before, the white Eurocentric thing about the Ukraine war, and that the fact that what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, and Anti raised it with Iran, with when Trump withdrew from the agreement on nuclear weapons, and they're now expecting Iran to go along. Well, Iran said no, they'll continue testing and doing what they're doing until such time as America and the West stick to that original agreement. Now, there's real dangers of war and in all parts of the world. Look at what's going on in Yemen and other parts of the war. And the British left don't say very much about it. They don't say much about what's going on in Israel. So there's a danger of a world war. Now, how do we change that and get it that we're actually having a world revolution? Because that's what we actually need, a world revolution, to actually change the things and balance of forces on a world scale. But we're even lacking here the very fact that there's such poverty and they got away with it so far with the current economic crisis. You know, what they've done to pensioners and people on benefits, how they expect them to manage the heating prices and everything else with the cost of living the way it is. I mean, my pension didn't go up hardly at all. My work's pension didn't go up very much. And I don't qualify for pensioner credit. So it's a real struggle because you miss out on so many other things if you don't. But nobody's really doing much about it. And that's why we need it. But the brilliant thing at the moment, if you think about it, the CWU, my union, both on the postal side and the telecom sides, they're taking industrial action or balloting for industrial action. You've got the railways, you've got the university lectures, and class struggle is actually taking the form of strike action again. And people have said, we've had enough, we're not putting up with it anymore. And that's an important part of the struggle. So how do we bring about the fight for true democracy within our unions and in society, and what form do we want that democracy to take? I'm for a democratic workers' republic, right? I'm a Republican. But how do we bring that about? So these are some of the things we need to be thinking about. What demands do we raise? When do we raise them? What discussions should we be having? And how do we bring all the, because there's crisis in society, total crisis in every aspect of life. How do we bring by using single issue campaigns on certain things, and how do we then broaden it out? How do we develop a socialist consciousness? So that's, for me, is what we need to be thinking about. But the fight for democracy is key, as far as I'm concerned. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Marion. That was an excellent contribution, to which I'm sure Steve will have lots to say. Okay, thanks very much, Marion. Steve, I'm coming back to you now.
Okay, just to say one slight thing. Somebody seems to have got my name and answering now. There's things coming up in the chat that say they're coming from me, but they're not.
Yes.
But I'm looking at them, I'm thinking, well, I'd say something a bit like that. So I've got but whoever's impersonating me is doing a pretty good job. But I just wanted to record it. It isn't actually me, you know what I mean? So there we go. So I'm not.
The real
I'm
Steve Freeman stand
yeah, the
up,
real
yeah.
whoever that is. Just a warning, comrades, in case I start saying something really wild, and then that'll really get you all going. I've got nothing to do with it. Anyway, coming back to Marion, I'll go to Marion and then Paul. I agree with the general thrust of what Marion says. I'm not going to try and answer everything that she said. It was a very good contribution. I think what I'm trying to argue is that there's a gap between the objective conditions which are ripe for democratic change, for some form of political, democratic and constitutional change. They really are ripe for that because our system is breaking back. On the other hand, they're ripe for a republic, is another way of putting it. This country is ripe for a republic, but objectively, but subjective consciousness is not come to that point yet. There isn't a Republican movement in this country, in England anyway. There is in Ireland, obviously. And there'll be one coming in Scotland, I think, and maybe even in Wales at some point, but not in England. There's not a Republican movement, and there's not a Republican Party. Obviously not, the Labour Party is not Republican. There's not even a Republican wing of the Labour Party. You know, and I would describe some of the more left organisations of the Labour Party tend to be what I would call anti-monarchist rather than Republican. So they don't think it's that important because the Queen is not the crown. The Queen doesn't do much. Why bother wasting your time with her then? You know, and all that kind of argument. So they've kind of disabled themselves by not understanding the nature of power, political power in this country, and who's wielding it and how they're doing it. So somehow the transitional method, Marion, I think, is exactly about finding a way to fill that gap between objective conditions and the consciousness of people. And I think that's coming back to what we're trying to talk about. If we're really talking about a transitional program, whether we call it that or not, the method is to say, well, what demand is it? Is it proportional representation? No, I don't think so. That's merely a sign that people have become interested in the democratic question. They can see there's a problem and think, well, what would solve the problem? Oh, PR might do it. Let's try that. Let's give that a go. You know what I mean? And so for me, trying to say, well, just a republic seems a bit too abstract. So coming back to what I was saying, we need to develop an argument for a parliament in England. Now, whereas PR is about reforming the House of Commons, a parliament for England is about closing down the House of Commons. It's kind of more radical than you might imagine. It's saying, let's have something in the middle of the country that represents the whole country, and not this completely bankrupted and very expensive, ancient, Gothic palace in London. You know, so people will try to reform the Westminster system, but actually we need to really think about a break from it. And that's, by the way, not something we have to wait till somebody does it. Even during the 2000 and during the Iraq War, a People's Assembly was set up, and they get people gathered to discuss the war. So there's nothing to stop us starting on the track of having an English Parliament, an English Assembly, not yet official, but just planting the seeds. It's something that can be done. You know what I mean? And the crisis can do it. And my last point, probably, Marion, is you're quite right. We mustn't separate the industrial from the political, because if workers start going on strike, this political system that I'm talking about, it puts jet fuel into that. It poses questions that people think, well, how's the government doing this? What's going on? What powers have they got? And so on. So we mustn't, although I'm talking pure politics, the industrial aspect of this has to come together. The industrial is possibly the rocket fuel that will get the whole thing going. I don't know, you know, because people might go beyond. You know, if you have a general strike, well, then it comes to the question, well, who's in charge of the constitution? What, you know, all those sort of questions get raised. So yeah, I'm sympathetic to that idea. To what Paul said, and I agree with what Paul said, but I don't quite know the answer to it. But it's absolutely true. For a long time, Crown properties gave different laws, could do different things, could absent themselves. And this is a legal thing. Like hospital didn't have to go under health and safety rules, for example, and things like that, because they were Crown properties. Now, don't quote me on this, but I know the principle is right. I don't necessarily know the detail just off the top of my head. And it may be that they didn't have to follow, it may be that in Downing Street, they didn't legally have to follow the COVID rules. I don't know, it's possible, but they wouldn't admit that anyway, because that poses another question. So Paul, it'd be interesting to draw that to our attention. And of course, the other point that Paul made, even if we had a very, very democratic, the most democratic system we could have, everything was run democratically, including our workplaces. If there was still private property, if there was still monopoly, the democracy wouldn't work. You cannot start to have a democracy if you don't start to take into public ownership. So some of the major concentrations of economic power that can destroy any democracy. So I think democracy leads you to the question of who owns what, who controls what, and becomes who owns what. So that's democracy's transitional to questioning who the hell owns all the industries in this country anyway, you know. And you can have a measure of workers' control in a factory, even if it's privately owned. You know, workers can build up their own shop stewards and other organisations. You know, I'll stop there. Sorry.
Right. Thanks very much, Steve. Going on to Tony Greenstein now. If you'd like to unmute, Tony.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, Marion asked all the right questions. Basically, how do we achieve socialism? How do we unify the socialist movement? How do we overcome the crippling crisis we're in? I think we do have to start with a form of analysis, and these are often the questions that Marxist and socialist groups don't ask. Because if you look, for example, let me give you an example. The Socialist Workers' Party is probably the longest, almost, far left group in Britain. It was the International Socialists, and before that the Socialist Review group. If you read its material, Socialist Worker, from the year dot, every week the struggle continues. They never draw up a balance sheet. There's never any analysis of where things have gone wrong as well as where they've gone right. The result is that we're often pushed into yet more greater activism in the hope that one final push will achieve our object. I think sometimes we have to sit back and think, why have we not achieved what we want? Where have we gone wrong? What are the fundamental obstacles in our way? Because it's not simply that we haven't been good enough, that maybe if there had been a generation of revolutionaries who were different to us, maybe they would have succeeded because we have certain personal faults that we can't overcome. In my view, and it is my view, but I mean, Lenin pointed it out in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, that part of the reason for the conservatism of the British working class is it believes, and not without cause, that it was feeding off and dining off the crumbs from the imperialist table. In other words, it was complicit in imperialism to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, for example, after the war, I mean, this is my area of specialism in terms of history, imperial history, that Britain was absolutely broke after Lend-Lease. We had to go begging on our knees to the United States for a $3 billion loan, which today is probably about $300 billion from the United States. And we were given it, but we were given it on certain terms. And obviously, I don't have time to go into the details of that. But at the same time, that was the most reforming government. It gave us the NHS, it gave us social security, and so on. And how did it do it? By super exploitation of the colonies. Malaya with the rubber, where they fought a counterinsurgency war. Ghana with the cocoa, and so on. And then Kenya, if you remember, with the horrific massacres and tortures and concentration camps that Britain set up against the Mau Mau. So in a sense, the British working class ideologically has always gone along with imperialism. And that's in essence what Brexit was about. It was the return to the golden age of what people saw as when Britain was powerful, putting the great back in Great Britain. Now, of course, the motivations of Boris Johnson and that section of the ruling class, because the ruling class was divided, was to get rid of even the basic social protections of the European Union. And if you like, to have a race for the bottom. So that there were actually no minimal social protections. The working time regulations could go, health and safety could go, in order to make British capitalism competitive. So I mean, that's my, if you like, analysis. As regards the issue of the crown and so on and so forth. Look, the crown is the symbol of the British state.
Mm.
Yes, people revere the crown, and the way they do it for ordinary people is by identifying with how wonderful Queen Elizabeth is. So they do that on a personal level. Of course, there are problems because the majority of them are not someone who's kept their mouths shut, by and large, at least in public, but people like Prince Andrew, who has gone off the rails. And not only Andrew, incidentally. I mean, Prince Philip had a penchant for friendly relations with paedophiles, influential paedophiles in the Church of England. Peter Ball, the Bishop of Lewis, is one such example. But every capitalist state, if you like, mystifies, surrounds itself with mystification, so that it's intangible. People can't get on it, into it. You can't let the light in, as Walter Badjo said in the 19th century. But America has American exceptionalism, the manifest destiny. The American Constitution itself is a religious object when you think about it. And one could go on. Israel, the Jewish state, this myth of the Jewish people. And we could go on. Hitler had the 1,000-year Reich and so on. So what I'm saying is that, yes, I mean, capitalist states take particular forms. We have taken the form of a monarchy. And that's fine. But I don't see that the fight for a monarchy, the fight for a republic, is separate from the fight for socialism, for the overthrow of socialism. They go hand in hand. Of course, socialists must be Republicans by definition. We don't believe in inherited privilege or power. That goes without saying. But to separate out the two, I think, is a mistake. Thank you, comrades. I know I've gone on far too long, Carol. My apologies. Carol, I can't hear you. Can everyone else hear?
I can't hear Carol. No, we can't hear Carol.
I'm terribly sorry.
Okay.
I'm terribly sorry. I muted myself. Sorry. I'm just saying thank you very much, Tony. And if anybody else, I'm sure Steve will want to come back on that. Anybody else who would like to contribute, please put your hands up so I can bring you in as a panelist. Right, Steve, over to you.
Okay. Okay, Tony. Well, a couple of things to say. First of all, I agree with the first part of what you had to say, and in fact might even add to that, because I think if you trace the history of the British Crown, even in the British monarchy, you could argue, and I would argue that Britain, if you were going to describe our monarchy in the 19th century, you might describe it as an imperial monarchy, and the imperial monarchy was specifically with the Empress of it when the Queen Victoria came out of mourning, as it were, came back into public life and was crowned the Empress of India in 1874. Okay, this was shaping the whole culture and attitude and values of this country as the British Empire. I mean, that's where the British Empire was, and as you say, the aristocracy of Labour and all that. That's where the Labour Party was formed in this same period of British imperialism. But when you get through to my argument is when you get through to the Second World War, for the reasons that you gave, Tony, that the whole British, even if you look at pictures of the monarchs, by the way, back in, I don't know, 1900 or 1920, they look like imperial. They really look very imperialist with the kind of hats and gear they wear. It's right, quite outstanding how imperialistic they look. But when you get to what's happening is there's this transformation taking place in the 1940s, and the imperial monarchy is more or less being replaced by a social monarchy. But in international terms, as you say, what's really happening is that the real prop for our social monarchy continuing is America. If America hadn't propped the whole thing up, it wasn't the British Empire propping us up anymore. Really, it was America. And so we had this social, well, it was seen as a kind of advance towards socialism that was going on there, and it was implying, that the working class was getting a new social contract. We're not going to go back to the 1930s. There was a break, because if you arm the working class and send them off to fight and then they come home again, you're not in the same political situation as you were in the 1930s. So the working class through Labour wanted something different. So we made a transition to a different kind of monarchy. And we still had the dying of the empire, Tony, because, and also don't forget, financial capitalism. The City of London also spread its net even wider in the 1980s than ever before, so it revived itself. So I think you've got to follow through historically how the system is developing. And it's not good enough, I would say, as a historical materialist, just to simply say that every bourgeois state is like every other bourgeois state. You said how America had things like what we have. Well, they do in a certain sense, but they have their own version of it and their own history to get there. And we have to confront our own history in a way, to go from the particular way in which it manifests itself to more general solutions. So I think that we have to take account of how did this country get to become a constitutional monarchy? How did the working class fight its way through that? How did we get through the Second World War to a social monarchy? Why has that gone into crisis? Why is it now destroyed and degenerate? I mean, it's a stage of absolute degeneration that requires us to do something. So I kind of agree. And listening to you, but when we start to disagree is we're not quite agreement on the crown and the monarch, because you're still slightly jumping between the two. And I think you need to separate them in order to understand how they really fit together. It's like pulling apart use value and value, which form the commodity, to examine them in order to understand how they fit together. And they do fit together. The crown and the queen do go together, but they're not the same thing. And I think you see the crown as some sort of ideological power. What I see it as the power of money. I see it as the power of the fact the crown employs 4 million people. It's like a business. It's like a capitalist enterprise at the heart of our political system. Therefore, it's more material than just ideological. So I think that I would simply say that although you do recognize, I'm listening to what you're saying, and you do recognize they're not the same thing. I don't think you've kind of well, you're either not in agreement or not understood. I don't know which one it is. That what we're trying to argue is something different. The crown must be understood as the state power, but the peculiarly historically formed version of capitalist state power as it is in this country. That is the state power that we have to confront.
Thank you very much, Steve. Marie's come through as a panelist. I'm going to go to Marie next. I can see Tony's got his hand up again. Tony, I'll come back to you after Marie, okay? So, Marie, over to you.
Hello, yes, everybody, this is a very important discussion. I agree with what the comrades have said. It seems to me that we have to pay attention to the fact that so much pomp and circumstance is also to hide things. It is not the expression of real power. It is the expression of being in charge, having the means, owning the means by which to publicize and to propagandize for what is not, actually it is not, has got no value, because a power which is based on privilege has no value, and yet it's given there so much prominence that it looks like it cannot last. And there is there was something, I thought, in the ceremonies of the Jubilee, something, there was a feverishness to actually make a splendid display of this, as if somehow there was something else which had to be hidden, and the something else was very soon found out when Johnson was booed. Even though perhaps that was not a huge event, it was a very profound one, because it came from people who had come for the Jubilee. They had not come to make a demonstration. They were people who were who were coming for the ceremony and were participating outside, and who showed their disapproval. And in so doing, they made a separation between what would be perhaps a thanksgiving to the Queen, that would be the way they would see it, and their disgust at the government. And this disgust is very widespread. It is huge, just that it's hidden by the fact that the press is not reporting. We live in a moment where, when the press actually can say that black is white, and that somebody is a criminal when that person is in fact only trying to protest. And all these bills which are being passed in Parliament, one after the other, they are to silence people, and that surely is a sign that something is not right. So it seems to me it was important also that a lot of ceremony took place at St. Paul's, which is a very imposing building, and all the history and all the tradition brought into play to actually magically transform something which is abominable, which is privilege, transform it into something which is to be lauded and which is to be respected. It's like a miracle which is supposed to be taking place in there. And we saw that again when Corbyn was being grilled, and he was being grilled for not being good enough as a prime minister, and that was he was faced by people of churches, people of religions, who suddenly had a say in judging him. Well, surely this is calling into question the role of mystification, which I think 2 or 3 comrades have raised. The mystification is a way of taking us away and removing the confidence from people, just making you feel small in front of the big changes which you only can carry out. Us, the humans, we are the only ones who can do things. And so if you are made to feel small, then you are going to lose confidence of doing it. And this is one of the aspects of, and also to make you fall on your knees in front of fate and in front of the events of history and of nature that you cannot control. So it's just to submit you to the force of outside of the human being. This is what mystification does, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the Republic that Tony Benn was talking about was also the church and state would be separated. This is a key question, though that is rarely discussed. And I call on the comrades to come and discuss their viewpoints at our Republican meetings. There is just another aspect. Am I speaking too long, Carol?
No.
Well, I think we need to round. I think you need to wind down now, Marie.
Okay, so I'm going to wind down now. Marian raised the question of war. And I don't know how we managed through all these meetings that we are having in the last period in the country. And this matter is hardly ever raised. And yet, if you want to expropriate anything, like Steve was saying, we need to expropriate, and I agree, but we find ourselves in front of properties which are internationally owned. When you look well, this is what it is, including and then all the wealth of the monarch, all that which is in the Bank of England, all that is in fact international finance, and the actual military force of all of this, of the state and of its finances, is international, and in my opinion is represented by NATO. And NATO is at war now, is preparing for war, and we are in front of such a big problem, and therefore it's no surprise that there is quiet in the people, the mass of the people, because there is no party which actually discusses this. So I propose that in the Republican Party, in the Republican group that we are, I'm going to put the details of it again on the chat. I propose that comrades come and they raise these issues so that it's not just one discussion one day, but that it is a continuous discussion. Right, I finished now.
Thank you very much indeed, Marie. That was an excellent contribution. Thank you. I'm going to go back to Tony now, and then I'll go back to Steve. Okay, Tony.
Yes,
You can
thank you.
unmute.
Yes, there's a lot. I mean, I agreed with Steve that we had the imperial monarchy from, well, you say 1874 when Victoria was crowned empress after the Indian Mutiny, but I would argue it was actually well before, going back to the colonization of the Americas. Throughout that period, we've had an imperial monarchy. But I think today it's become not so much a social monarchy as the imperialist monarchy. I mean, it's no accident that members of the royal family are the colonels in chief and whatever the other titles of every British regiment, for example. They're highly intertwined with the military hierarchy. It was noticeable that one of the first things about Andrew when he was, if you like, disestablished, was he lost all his military titles as well, because the regiments didn't want to be associated with someone whose name was so tarnished. So yes, the monarchy has changed, but I mean, the fundamental point is about the role of British capitalism. I mean, I mentioned Attlee, where reform at home was bought at the price of exploitation abroad. We have since become intertwined and a subsidiary partner of the United States imperialism. I think it was Dean Acheson said that we've lost an empire but haven't yet found a role. And that has been the continuous problem of British capitalism. It first looked to Europe Now it's looking back to the United States. It harks back to an independent role that it hasn't economically got the power to sustain. And as Marie said, I mean, we're entering a period which is a very uncertain and a very dangerous one, whereby we're seeing NATO flex its muscles, or that means the United States in terms of China and Russia at the moment. So these are all very uncertain periods. But the main trick, if you like, of capitalism has always been to get people to think that their main enemy is not those who are responsible for the conditions they're in, but the guy who's even poorer, the black person, maybe the gay person, whoever, whichever minority, whichever scapegoat, benefit claimants are a good target, and so on. And that's part of what the crown is. It's a symbol, the means by which people identify with their own ruling class, and they do that through the monarchy. And when the monarchy becomes tarnished, or individuals do, they replace them. That happened with Edward VIII and the abdication, of course. When Edward VIII went off the rails and started supporting Hitler, they decided it was time that he was moved aside in favour of his idiot brother, and that's exactly what happened. So yes, the crown is important as a symbol and as a mystification of the real power relations, but we have to ask what's behind it, and we have to also understand that the demand, obviously, for a republic in the sense of removal of the monarchy is a progressive one, but it won't be an answer to our problems necessarily. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'm going to go back to Steve. I don't see any more hands up. So I'm assuming that other people are not wanting to make any further contributions. So I'm going to go back to Steve now for his concluding remarks.
Okay, I like Marie's contribution and thoughtful contribution, and I agree with it. And she raised this other point, and I think about church and state. I mean, all capitalist states have something in common. What's peculiar, I've sometimes taken to calling our state the Tory state. You know what I mean? It's like the Tory, what's the principles of Toryism that they keep ramming down our throats? Well, number one, they're absolutely wedded to the monarchy. Number two, they're absolutely wedded to the union. They will go on about it. And three, the third one is the Church of England, the established Church of England. Three fundamental principles. You won't find any conservative party in the world apart from ours that goes union, monarchy, and Church of England. It's quite unique in that sense. That's why it's been going on for such a long time. And so if that's the principles of the Tory state, then Labour shares those principles, by the way. You know, so Labour's a kind of promise that we'll get to socialism by using the Tory state. So one way of thinking about it. Obviously, that can't possibly be the case. Marie also mentioned NATO, and I think that just come in very important because the social monarchy, as I said, this 1945 settlement, this social contract, which is often seen to be progressive if you look inside the country. If you look internationally at what that means, it's completely different. You have to go to Palestine, you have to go to India and Pakistan, you have to go to the formation of NATO to see the reality of that. So NATO is something born with the social monarchy, born with the shall we say, the Cold War, you know, born as a way that Britain wanted to bind itself to America. So America, the social monarchy all go together, I think. And so a criticism of the social monarchy, I think you have to deal with the question, and I agree with that. Not that we particularly discussed it in the Republican Labour group. Let's have a look. So Tony's point about, and I agree with that. Again, I just would ask Tony, because Tony slips between the Queen and the Crown. So on one hand, he sees they're different, and on the other hand, he sort of slips between one and the other. And I'm asking him to think about whether you can really identify. So sometimes when he's talking about the Crown, he's kind of talking about the Queen and the ideological power of the Queen. And the Queen exists basically to divert attention away from the Crown. So what the idea is, how do we know that we're a democracy? Well, there's two reasons that we know that we're a democracy, apparently. Number one is that the Queen has absolutely no power, doesn't do anything political at all, never says anything, is completely and utterly powerless. So that's the monarchy for you. And then on the other hand, we've got the House of Commons, which has total power, is really in charge of everything. Now, both of those things are false, by the way, but they're both diverting, they're both masks for the central power of the crown. And I would express it like this: the Queen is a mask for the crown, and the crown is a mask for the City of London. That's where the whole thing ties together. Queen, crown, City of London. I mean, it's no coincidence that when the Queen, well, there are certain events anyway where the Queen goes to the City of London, enters the City of London, meets the Lord Mayor of the City of London, and bows her head as she goes in. It's the only place where she does, because there's that original, go back to 1688, to that formation of our constitutional monarchy and the role of the city in all of that. What I would say then about republicanism, again, Tony says, well, look, we're all Republicans. As some people say, well, we're all Republicans. That could be, yeah, let's fight together. Or it could be, we're all Republicans, so why bother mentioning it? You know, that version of it. If it's so obvious that we're all Republicans, we don't need to talk about it. Now, I would approach that by saying we need something slightly more concrete than that. And that's why I suggested that what I'm interested in, not whether Tony's a Republican or is a different kind of Republican to me, but whether Tony agrees with the idea of that we should campaign for a parliament in England. Now, that is a different way of dealing with the question of republicanism, is a different way of getting to it. Now, that's not an argument that's ever existed on the left much, but it's in Tony Benn's bill. And I think if we're going to approach people, we have to get to that level, if you like, of something slightly more concrete than just the abstract. I want to see a parliament based on the sovereignty of the people, which would be a Republican parliament, obviously. But a parliament for England, I think, is where we have to go. I mean, there's a much bigger argument to be made than now. We ought to have this out in other forum. But I think that's the way of going back to Marion's point. How do we bridge the gap between subjective consciousness and the objective conditions? I do believe a transitional program has to include the demand for a parliament for England. And some people may or may not agree with that. Yeah, that's what I'd say. So for me, just to finish on this point, Tony, it's just clarifying. When you say that, you say the crown is ideological, but what you really talk about is the Queen is ideological. The crown is actual power, and you have to analyze the source of that power. It's military power, it's police power. Yeah, the IRA knew it. They call them they always said it's crown forces. They understood the crown was a force, and they understood when they were meeting crown forces. They never met the Queen at all at any point, by the way, but they certainly met crown forces. And I think they understood that more than we tend to do here in England. And I'll finish there.
Thanks very much indeed, Steve.
In fact, Tony's just said that in the, just to finish off, Tony's just said that in the chat, and I agree with him. There we go.
So I've got Marie has put a hand up again, and Paul has also put his hand up. So I'm going to bring in, I'm going to make them panelists again, and I think we will need to run the discussion down then. Right, doesn't seem to be working terribly well. Right, promote to right, yes, I think you've got Tony, I think you've got Paul in, yes, we've got Paul in. And I think Marie's coming in. So Paul, let's go to you first.
Yeah, in my view, the call for an English Parliament really cannot be overstated, because I think many people on the left, and I've held the view quite a long time now, they tend to dismiss it because we've got the House of Commons. So I think, so I think people think, well, that just, you know, I think they just think, they think of it as right-wing English nationalism. But in fact, England does actually have quite a radical history, as we've been finding out from our various webinars every week. But of course, Westminster is in fact the UK Parliament. It's not the English Parliament. But of course, over, since around 1997, or if not before, the fact that Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland had their own parliament to some degree. Well, obviously Scotland had a parliament, Wales and Northern Ireland have a smaller power, the assemblies. And actual fact, even London has its own assembly, which has quite a lot of powers, and it has a mayor as well. But of course, Westminster is part of the Crown in Parliament and so on. And recently, after the Brexit referendum and the proroguing in Parliament, the separation of powers actually exposed a bit of a constitutional crisis because, as far as I understand it, I might be wrong, but one of our Republican Labour members pointed out that the Scottish judiciary has actually been independent from the Crown for quite some time, and they were the group of judges that first questioned the idea of the legality of proroguing Parliament, and secondly, a couple of weeks ago, I noticed there was a debate in the Welsh Assembly calling for legal powers to have control over their legal system in Wales. The problem is the Welsh Assembly doesn't currently have the power to actually give themselves that power. So we're gradually seeing, and Brexit was part of that, but we are now seeing a crisis of democracy within the individual nations of the UK, because people are starting to realise that actually we're not equal with, some parts of the UK got more power than others. So I'm hoping I'm making some kind of sense, but yeah, it's opened up a kind of schism, and it made me realise that in the end, I thought, well, yeah, Westminster might be based in England, but actually, for the UK, it's not for England. But of course, other components of the UK does have its own separate representation. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thank you. Steve, would you like to come back
Paul,
in there?
you're making, I don't even make sense to everybody else, but you're making perfect sense to me, Paul. That I thought was a very good contribution and getting into the issue really well. So well done for that. What I would say, can I add anything to that really? Well, the point is that England was left out of the democratic settlement of 1997, 1998. Tony Benn didn't leave it out of his bill, but Tony Blair did. In the event, Tony Blair said, I didn't really want to. I wish I hadn't done those parliaments for Scotland. It's caused problems. Next minute they want to go on further and start doing all sorts of different things, So it's obviously that Blair wished he'd never given Wales and Scotland, but now he has. He created an imbalance, an unfinished. This is another mix and fix and mess that our constitution's in. It's got no rationale. It's got no logic. But England has the biggest democratic deficit, which is why all sorts of provisions in Scotland and Wales are made by their parliaments that are better than the ones in England. Now, the problem is the absence, the deeper democratic deficit in England can be filled by the right or the left. It's not the case that people will turn to a left-wing answer to that. They will turn, and you can see Brexit as an answer to that kind of English feeling amongst English people that they've lost their democracy in some way. You know, well, we were never a democracy in the first place, but anyway, whatever it was, they were persuaded that all the woes were because we were in the European Union, and then if we left the European Union, we'd be able to get our democracy back. You know, that was a slogan: take back control. So the right were able to, and the Tories were able to grab this kind of English nationalism and give it a slightly racist right-wing content. And it's very, very dangerous if the left doesn't counter that and come forward with an alternative to that. It's leaving the field open for right-wing and the racists to mobilize a kind of white nationalism. You know, that's a really big danger. Republicanism isn't white. Republicanism is universal. It's about equality and solidarity. You know, it doesn't have an ethnic idea to it. You can have ethnic people making ethnic stuff, but it doesn't. It's about everybody being citizens. So we have to have a left-wing answer to this. And it's very dangerous to leave this vacuum for the right, and that the left doesn't wake up and doesn't do that. So you're absolutely right. The English Parliament was abolished, people don't realise this, in 1707, because the Act of Union, which actually physically abolished the Scottish Parliament, it made the English Parliament still sat there as it always was. But as soon as all the Scottish MPs came down from the Scottish Parliament and sat in the Westminster Parliament, then they'd made the British Parliament, and the English Parliament didn't exist anymore. It came into existence with the Union, and it'll come about again somehow or other with the crisis of the Union Islands, Scotland and Wales. So we need to get ahead of the game on this and listen to what Tony Benn said and start to make a really coherent argument that the road to republicanism is to really say to people, it's not PR that you're looking for. It's a different parliament to the House of Commons, which is completely bankrupted and useless. It's a joke as a parliament. I mean, it's a national embarrassment what goes on in the House of Commons. It's about time we shut the whole thing down and put up something completely new. Finish
Thank
there.
you very much indeed, Steve. Thank you. There's no more hands up, so I would like to say thank you to Steve, and thank you to all the people who've attended and the excellent contributions that have been made by our attendees. So thank you very much indeed to everybody, and I'm going to close the meeting now.